In the autumn of 1888, in the high timber country above the Bitterroot Valley in Montana Territory, a woman of 29 stood at the edge of a clearing and looked at a cabin no one in the town of Salt Fork had wanted for 9 years. The men at the land office had laughed when she signed her name to the claim. They told her the place was worthless, that the trapper who built it had died owing money to half the valley, that the roof had fallen and the chimney had split and the snow had gotten into the walls. They told her she was paying good labor and a long winter for a pile of rotting logs. What none of them knew, and what she did not yet know herself, was that the dead trapper had built 2 rooms into that cabin, and only one of them could be seen from the door. Her name was Hannah Vance, and she had come north with a wagon, an old mule named Dub, and a wooden chest of tools that had belonged to a man who taught her everything she knew about joinery, and never once told her she could not learn it because she was a girl. The chest held chisels and a brace and bit, a draw knife worn thin from use, and a small bronze plumb bob on a waxed cord. She had buried that man in the spring. She had no people left who would take her in, and no husband to sign a claim in his own name, and so she had done the thing the town found absurd. She had claimed the dead trapper's cabin for the back taxes owed on it, $4.60, and she meant to make it stand. When stay with me, because the thing she found behind the north wall had been waiting in the dark for 9 years, and it changed everything the valley believed about the man they had buried as a debtor. The cabin sat at the end of a logging trace that had grown over with young larch and bracken. Hannah walked the last half-mile leading Dub by the bridle, the wagon wheels groaning in ruts left from another decade. When the clearing opened, she stopped and stood a long moment. The cabin was larger than she had expected. It had been built of squared timber, not round logs. The corners dovetailed with a tightness that surprised her even at a distance. The roof had sagged on the eastern slope where a limb had come down, and the door hung open on one leather hinge, and the whole structure leaned slightly into the hill as though listening. Still, the bones of it were good. She could see that from where she stood. Whoever had built this had known what he was doing. She let Dub graze and went inside alone. The single room smelled of cold ash and animal and the particular mineral dampness of a place the sun had not reached in years. A stone hearth filled the western end. A rough table lay on its side, one leg broken. There was a bunk frame against the south wall, and pegs along the timbers where traps and snowshoes must once have hung, and a low shelf with the remains of tin cans gone to rust. Hannah set down her satchel and turned slowly, reading the room the way her teacher had taught her to read any piece of work. "Look at the joints," he used to say. "The joints will tell you who made it, and whether he was honest." She looked at the joints. They were honest. The dovetails were cut clean and seated dry, no shimming, no filler, the work of a patient hand. It was when she came to the north wall that the room first lied to her. She did not understand it at once. She felt it before she understood it. The way a carpenter feels a floor that is out of level before the eye confirms it. The north wall was the long wall, the one that backed into the rising ground behind the cabin. Hannah paced the room, heel to toe, counting. Then she went outside and paced the length of the cabin along the north side, heel to toe, counting again. She came back in and stood very still. The room inside was shorter than the cabin outside by the better part of 9 feet. There was a space behind the north wall that the door could not see, and no opening anywhere to reach it. A lesser carpenter would not have caught it. The hidden wall had been built to match the others exactly the same, squared timber, the same honest dovetails, the same patina of 9 years of cold. Whoever had sealed that space had wanted it to read as the back of the world. Yet the man who taught Hannah had drilled one thing into her above all others. "A building does not lie," he said, "but a builder can." And the lie is always in the measurements. She did not break the wall open that day. She was not a person who broke things to learn them. She spent the rest of the daylight making the cabin habitable enough to survive the first frost, righting the table, clearing the hearth, stuffing the worst gaps in the eastern roof with bracken and a tarpaulin from the wagon. She built a small fire and ate cold biscuit and watched the light go blue and then violet in the open doorway, and she thought about the 9 feet of darkness on the other side of the timber at her back. She did not sleep much. She lay listening to the cabin settle in the cold, and she heard nothing from the hidden room, because the dead keep their own counsel, and the things they hide keep it with them. In the morning she walked the 4 miles down to Salt Fork for nails and lamp oil, and to ask plainly who the dead trapper had been. The town was a single rutted street with a land office, a general store, a livery, and a saloon that opened early for the men coming off the night shift at the stamp mill up the creek. Hannah tied Dub at the store rail and went in, and the talk dropped the way talk drops when a stranger enters, and then rose again louder when they saw who it was, the woman from the trapper's cabin. One of the men at the counter, a big freighter named Coyle with a red face and an easy laugh, asked her how she liked her mansion. He asked whether she had found the gold yet, and the others laughed, because everyone knew the story. That old Amos Reedy had talked his whole life about a fortune he never had, and died owing every soul in the valley, and his cabin had stood empty as a fool's monument ever since. She did not rise to it. She had learned, in the year of burying the man who taught her and finding her own way north, that a person who answers mockery feeds it, and that silence costs the mocker more than any retort. She turned her shoulder to Coyle and waited at the counter, and the laughter, finding no purchase, thinned and went back to its own talk of freight rates and the price of ore. A younger man near the door watched her with something that was not laughter, a kind of uneasy attention, and looked away when she caught it. She marked him without knowing why. She would learn his name later. For now she only bought what she had come for. Hannah bought her nails and her oil. She asked the storekeeper, a careful man named Pruitt, what he could tell her about Amos Reedy. Pruitt wiped the counter and said Reedy had been a trapper and a tinker and a man who kept to himself, that he had run a trap line up the high creeks for 30 years, that he had borrowed against his catch more than once and never quite paid it back, and that he had died alone in the winter of '79 and been found in the spring by a man checking the line. He owed the bank, Pruitt said. He owed Mr. Garner most of all. Hannah asked who Mr. Garner was. Pruitt's hand slowed on the counter. He looked once toward the open door, and then he lowered his voice the way a man lowers it when the thing he is about to say has cost other men dearly. Linus Garner held the paper on half the valley. He said he had come in after the war with money nobody could account for, and he had a way of lending to men who could not pay, and then holding their land when they could not. He had held the note on Reedy's claim, and let it go to the county for taxes, only because the cabin was worthless and the land too steep to farm. Pruitt said this last part carefully, the way a man says a thing he has decided not to think about too hard, smoothing the same clean spot of counter over and over, and then he sold her the nails and wished her luck and did not meet her eye. She asked him one more thing before she left. She asked whether Reedy had ever done any work for people, any mending or making, anything with his hands besides the traps. Pruitt's wiping stopped for the smallest moment. Then he said no, not that he knew of. The man was a trapper and nothing more, and he said it a little too quickly, and Hannah thanked him and went out into the cold street. She had asked the question to see what the answer would do to his face, and the answer had done something. Pruitt knew more than a trap line about Amos Reedy, so, she suspected, did half the older faces in that store. They had all agreed, somewhere along the years, on a smaller version of the man than the one who had really lived, and Hannah did not yet know why, but she knew the shape of a thing agreed upon to be forgotten. Hannah carried that name back up the hill with her. Linus Garner, a man who lent to those who could not pay and held what they could not keep. She did not know yet what it had to do with the 9 feet of darkness behind her north wall. She only knew that a man who built dovetails, that honest did not seem like a man who had nothing, and that the town had been very quick to agree he was a fool. That afternoon, she had gone over the north wall by lamplight, hand flat against the timber, reading the surface inch by inch, and she had found it at last, not by sight, but by draught. Down low, near the floor, where the third log met the corner post, a thread of cold air moved against the back of her hand. She knelt and held the lamp close, and saw that the chinking there was not the same as the chinking elsewhere. It was newer. It had been packed in from the inside by a man who knew he was sealing something, and it had been done well, but not so well that 9 years of frost had not opened a hairline at the seam. She pressed it with her thumb. The daubing crumbled. Behind it the wood was not wall, it was a door, hung flush, its edges hidden in the joinery with no handle and no hinge that showed. She remembered her teacher's voice. The lie is always in the measurements. And then, another thing he used to say, quieter, when he was pleased with a piece of work. A good door does not announce itself. A good door waits. It took her 3 days to open it without destroying it, and she could have done it in 3 minutes with a wrecking bar, but she would not. She believed that a man who hid a door this carefully had reasons, and that the reasons might still be sound, and that whatever waited behind it deserved to be reached the way it had been made, with patience and a steady hand. The first day she did nothing but study it. She cleared the old chinking from the seam with a thin blade, working from the floor upward, following the line of the join as it rose, and as she worked the outline of the door declared itself in the timber. A tall, narrow rectangle set so cunningly into the wall that a person could have leaned against it 100 times and never felt the edge. She found no handle, no latch plate, no iron, anywhere, whatever, held it shut, held it from within the wood itself. The second day she found the pivot. She knew it had to turn on something, and a door without hinges turns on a pin, top and bottom, hidden in the post. She tapped the timber along the post with the back of a chisel, listening, the way her teacher had taught her to sound a beam for rot or a hidden knot, reading the wood by the change in its voice. Most of the post answered solid. One short stretch, low down, answered with a faint hollowness, and she knew the pivot was there, seized by 9 years of damp and cold into a single swollen mass of oak. She did not force it. Forcing it would have split the post and ruined the door and told her nothing. She worked instead with the brace and bit, drilling a careful relief beside the swollen peg. And then with the thin chisel, she freed the wood a grain at a time, lifting curls of damp oak, no thicker than paper, stopping often to blow the dust clear and study what she had uncovered. She found the pivot at last, a hidden peg of oak set into the post, swollen tight with damp. She worked it for the whole of the third afternoon with the brace and bit and the thin chisel, freeing the wood a grain at a time, and as the light failed, she felt the peg shift under her hand, the smallest give, the way a frozen thing gives at the first true thaw. She set down the chisel and put both hands flat against the door, and pushed, steady and even, the way you ease a green board into place, rather than driving it. With the lamp low and the wind coming up cold through the larches outside, the door gave a sound like a held breath let go, and swung inward on a pin she had not been able to see, and the cold air of 9 sealed years came out of the dark and touched her face. She held the lamp into the opening, and did not move for a long time. The hidden room was perhaps 9 feet by 7, the width of the lie. The air inside was dry, far drier than the outer room, because Reedy had sealed it tight, and the hill behind held the cold steady, and the room was not empty. Against the back wall stood a workbench, heavy and well made, its surface worn pale and smooth at the place where a man's forearms had rested through years of close work. Above, it hung a rack of tools more careful than any she had seen outside her own chest. There were small files and gravers laid in order from coarse to fine, and a jeweler's loop on a cord, and a row of punches and chasing tools, each seated in its own slot cut to fit it. There was a tinker's portable forge, cold now, with a small hand bellows folded beside it, and crucibles stacked clean, and a set of scales in a wooden case with the brass gone soft green. There were drawers below the bench, and when she eased them open, they ran true on their tracks, even after 9 years, and they were full. This was not a trapper's room. This was the room of a man who made things, fine things, small things, and who had not wanted the valley to know it. She stood in the doorway a long while before she would step in, out of a kind of respect, as though she had opened a grave and found the dead man still at his work. Then she stepped in, and the floor did not so much as creak, because it too had been built honest, and she crossed to the bench and set her lamp down where his lamp must once have stood. On the bench, under a square of oiled cloth gone stiff, lay a ledger and a tin box, and beside them a thing wrapped in flannel that, when she drew the cloth away, caught the lamp and threw it back. A small finished object of worked silver, half complete, a brooch in the shape of a meadowlark with one wing still bare, metal where the engraving stopped. The other wing was finished to a fineness she could hardly believe, each feather laid in with a graver's patience, and the bird's eye was a single bright point, and the thing seemed on the edge of song. She held it to the light and turned it, and she understood that the man had been working on it the last winter of his life, and had set it down one evening meaning to take it up again, and had never come back to it. The half-finished wing was the truest measure of how he died. Not in his bed. Not at the end of a long settling. In the middle of a thing he meant to finish. Hannah set the lamp on the bench and sat down on the trapper's stool, because her legs had gone uncertain, and she understood that the town had buried the wrong man. Not a fool, not a debtor, who chased a fortune he invented. A craftsman who had been hiding what he made, and the question that opened under her like cold water was simple and terrible. Why would a man hide good work? Why would a man who could do this die owing $4 to the county and let the valley laugh at him? She did not sleep that night either. She read the ledger. The ledger was kept in a small, careful hand, the hand of a man who had been schooled somewhere before the frontier got him, and it was not a trapline ledger. It was a record of work done for higher dates and names and sums going back more than 20 years. A wedding ring repaired, a set of spurs chased with silver wire for a rancher down the valley, a christening cup. Hannah read the names and recognized some of them, the older families of Salt Fork, and she understood that for 2 decades Amos Reedy had been the secret silversmith of a town that knew him only as a trapper too proud to pay his debts. He had done the work after dark in the hidden room, and carried the finished pieces down to people who paid him quietly and never said where the work came from, because a man who could not pay his banknote had no business owning skill the bank could seize. And then, part way through the ledger, the entries changed. For the last 4 years of his life, the names stopped, and a single name took their place, over and over, in a hand that grew angrier as the pages turned. Garner, Linus Garner. And beside the name, not sums received, but sums owed, and a record that was not a craftsman's accounts, but a witness's testimony, written down because there was no one Reedy could tell. Stay close, because what Reedy wrote in the back of that ledger was the thing he died holding, and it was not about silver. It was about land, and about a fire, and about the way a man with money can make a true thing disappear if no one keeps the proof. What Reedy had written was this. Garner had come to him not as a banker but as a customer in the beginning, wanting a seal made of steel die for stamping documents, the kind a land agent might use to emboss a deed or a title. Reedy had made it because the work was honest and the pay was good. The second commission was not honest. Garner had brought him an old county land seal, worn and genuine, and asked Reedy to copy it exactly, to cut a new die that would stamp the mark of the territorial recorder. And Reedy, who read the meaning of work the way Hannah did, had understood what such a die was for. It was for making old deeds. It was for stamping a man's signature onto a transfer he never signed, and dating it years back, and filing it as though it had always been true. Reedy had refused, and from the day he refused, the ledger said, Garner had set out to ruin him. He called Reedy's small notes due all at once. He spread the word in the saloons that Reedy was a deadbeat and a liar who bragged of a fortune he did not have. He made the valley laugh at the one man who knew what he was, so that if Reedy ever spoke, no one would believe him. And Reedy, proud and alone and aging, had done the only thing left to a man with proof and no power. He had kept the evidence. He had kept the first honest die and a wax impression of the forged one, and the names of 3 families whose land Garner had taken with deeds that could not have existed when they were dated, and he had sealed it all in a room behind a wall, and he had waited for someone who could read a building to come and find it. He had waited 9 years. Hannah Vance had paid $4.60, and she was the one who came. She did not go down the mountain in a rage. That was not in her. She spent a week first, in the cold, bright days of early November, doing what a careful person does. She read the ledger 3 times until she had its whole shape. She found the wax impression of the forged seal, where Reedy had noted it in the tin box, wrapped in paper, and she found the original honest die beside it, and she laid the 2 seals together under the loupe and saw with her own eyes that one was a copy of the other, faithful in every line but for a single, deliberate flaw Reedy had left in the false one. A tiny break in the rim that an honest recorder would never have cut. He had signed his refusal into the forgery itself. He had made the lie carry a mark of its own falseness in case the day ever came. That was the kind of man the valley had buried. Laughing Hannah understood that the proof in her hands was dangerous, in a way the cabin had never been. A man who would ruin a craftsman over a refusal would do more than laugh. At a woman who held the evidence, she thought a long time about how to carry a true thing safely down a mountain into a town a powerful man owned. And she decided that she would not carry it down at all. Not first. She would bring the families up. The 3 names in the back of the ledger were a widow named Esther Cobb, whose husband had died and whose riverfront acreage Garner had taken on a deed she swore her husband never signed, an old man named Bill Tatum who had lost his father's homestead the same way and now split wood for the livery in town, Mexican-American settlers who had held a grant in the lower valley for 2 generations before a deed appeared, dated before their grant, that gave the land to Garner. Each of them had gone to the county. Each had been told the deeds were genuine, stamped with the recorder's seal, older than their claims. Each had been made to look like a liar or a fool, the way Reedy had been made to look, and each had quietly given up because you cannot fight a seal. Hannah walked down to Salt Fork and found Esther Cobb first, because a widow on her own would understand a widow's claim. She did not tell her everything at once. She said only that she had found something in the trapper's cabin that concerned the Cobb land, and that Esther should come up the mountain and see it with her own eyes and bring no one she did not trust. Esther Cobb was a thin, upright woman of 60, with hands cracked from laundry work, and she looked at Hannah a long moment and said she had stopped believing anything good came out of that cabin. In the end, she came. She came, and she stood in the hidden room with the lamp on the bench, and Hannah showed her the ledger entry in Reedy's careful hand, the date of the deed that had taken her husband's land, and then showed her in the same ledger the date Reedy had cut the false die, which was 2 years after the deed claimed to have been signed. The deed that took Esther Cobb's land had been stamped with a seal that did not exist when the deed was dated. Esther Cobb sat down on the trapper's stool as Hannah had, and put her cracked hands over her face, and did not weep so much as shake, the way a person shakes when a weight they have carried alone for years is suddenly shared. When she took her hands away, she said one thing. She said her husband had always told her the trapper was no liar. She had not believed him. Now she did. One by one, over the next 2 weeks, the others came. Old Bill Tatum climbed the trace on a borrowed horse, slow and stiff in the cold, and stood in the doorway of the hidden room a long moment before he would come in, as though the dark of it might still hold the man who built it. He read his father's name in the ledger with a finger under each word, his lips moving, and when he reached the entry that named the date of his father's lost homestead, he stopped and read it 3 times. Then he picked up the false die and turned it over and over in his thick fingers, saying nothing, his jaw working, and at last he said that his father had gone to his grave called a liar by the men who took his land, and that he, Bill, had half believed them, because a son learns to be ashamed of a father the town has decided to laugh at. He set the die down very gently, the way a man sets down something that has hurt him. He said he would come whenever she needed him, and he kept that word. The Reyes family sent the eldest son, a serious young man named Tomas, who climbed the trace on foot and arrived without complaint, though it was a hard walk for a working man to spend a day on. He read slowly and carefully, in the measured way of a man reading a second language he had mastered by labor, and he asked Hannah twice to explain the dates, not because he did not understand them, but because he wanted to be certain he understood them exactly. When he had it whole, he was quiet for a while, looking at the meadowlark brooch on its oiled cloth. Then he asked her in measured English whether she understood what it would cost her to stand against Linus Garner. He said it plainly, without drama, the way a man warns another man of a current he is nearly drowned in. Hannah said she understood. She said the cost of standing against him was nothing next to the cost of the man, knowing she had the proof and choosing to stay quiet. Thomas looked at her for a moment, weighing not her courage but her steadiness, and then he put out his hand, and they shook on it, the bench between them and the meadowlark brooch catching the lamp. He said his grandfather had cleared that lower ground with his own hands, and that the name on the land was older than the name of the man who had stolen it. Hannah said she believed him. She said the dead trapper had believed him too, and had written it down. What Hannah did next, she did the slow way, because the slow way was the only way that would hold. She did not accuse Garner. An accusation could be denied, and a woman's accusation in that valley could be laughed away as easily as Reedy's had been. Instead, she did what Reedy had done, only she did it where it could be seen. She wrote to the territorial recorder's office in the capital not to complain, but to request certified copies of the 3 disputed deeds and the dates of every seal die the office had authorized in those years. She paid the fee out of money she did not have, selling the tinker's scales and one of the finished silver pieces from the drawer to a buyer in another town who did not know Garner. And she waited through the deep of winter for the answer to come back, while the snow closed the trace, and she lived in the cabin with the hidden room open. Now its cold air mingled with the warmth of her fire, the dead man's bench her own workbench through the long dark months. She learned his tools by using them. She took up the gravers and practiced on scraps of soft pewter until her hand remembered the angles, and she came to know the man by the wear he had left, the way he had favored one file over another, the small notch worn into the edge of the bench where he had braced a piece 1,000 times. A craft is a kind of handwriting, her teacher had told her once, and a person who learns another's tools learns to read his hand. By midwinter she could have told you which gravers Reedy reached for first and which he kept for the finest work, and she felt less alone in the cabin for knowing it, as though she shared the room with a habit if not a man. The answer came in March, carried up the thawing trail by a boy from the livery who had been paid to bring it. The recorder's office had certified in a clerk's flat official hand the dates on which each authorized seal die had been cut and registered, and the date of the die that had stamped all 3 of Garner's deeds was a date 2 years after the deeds claimed to be signed. The capital's own records said the seal could not have existed when the deeds were dated. Reedy's ledger had told the truth. Now the territory's own papers said it too. Hannah laid the certified copies beside Reedy's ledger and the false die with its single deliberate flaw, and she understood that she now held a thing that even Linus Garner could not make disappear, because it no longer lived only in her hands. It lived in the recorder's office, in the certified record, in a clerk's indifferent script that owed Garner nothing. She brought it to the county seat herself in April, with Esther Cobb and Bill Tatum and Thomas Reyes beside her, the four of them walking into the land office together so that no one of them could be quietly silenced. She did not raise her voice. She laid the ledger on the counter, and the wax impression, and the certified dates, and the two dies side by side, the honest one and the false one with its flaw, and she explained plainly, in the order a person explains a piece of work, what each thing was and how it fit the next. The clerk sent for the county recorder. The recorder sent after a long while for the territorial marshal who happened to be in the seat that week, and the marshal, a tired man named Holloway who had seen Garner's kind before and could never prove them, listened to a woman lay out a forgery so cleanly that there was nothing left to argue. Linus Garner was not in the room. He was never in the room. Hannah had understood from the start that she would not face him, that a man like that is not defeated by being confronted, but by being made irrelevant, and that is what happened to him. The certified dates went into the county record beside his deeds. The marshal opened the matter formally. Garner's foundation had been the unquestioned authority of a seal, and once the territory's own hand had written that the seal was false, the deeds built on it were so much waste paper. He left the valley before the summer. Some said he went south. No one followed him, and no one needed to. He had been made into what he had made of Amos Reedy, a man whose word no longer carried and whom the valley no longer feared. The land came back slowly, the way true things come back, through filings and corrections and the patient turning of the law. Esther Cobb got her riverfront acreage restored before the next winter, and she grew old on it and was buried beside her husband on the rise above the water. Bill Tatum got his father's homestead and was too old to work it, but he gave it to a nephew and lived out his days knowing his father had not been a liar. The Reyes family recovered their grant, and Thomas farmed it, and in time his children farmed it, and the name stayed on the land where it had always belonged. Hannah Vance kept the cabin. She did not get rich. She had not done any of it to get rich, and the thought of profiting from Reedy's proof was distasteful to her, in a way she did not have words for and did not need them. She took nothing for herself but the cabin, and the tools, and the right to live in the place that had answered her. She mended the roof properly that summer, dovetailing new timber to old with the same honest joints Reedy had cut, so that you could not tell looking where his work ended and hers began. She opened the hidden room to the air and made it her shop. She finished the meadowlark brooch one winter evening, taking up the engraving where Reedy's hand had stopped 9 years before, cutting the last wing free of the bare metal. And when it was done, she could not have said which lines were his and which were hers, and that seemed to her the truest thing she could have made of it. The town did not apologize because towns do not. The laughter stopped, though. Coyle, the freighter who had asked her how she liked her mansion, hauled the new timber up the trace for her without being asked and would not take pay for it, and that was as near to an apology as such a man could come, and Hannah let it be enough. Pruitt, the storekeeper, began to send people up the mountain when they needed fine work done. A ring resized, a watch case mended, and he said her name now where he had once looked away. The valley learned slowly, the way valleys learn, that the worthless cabin at the end of the overgrown trace had held the proof that set 3 families right, and that the woman they had laughed at had read it out of the timber the way a person reads a letter left for them. She thought often of the man she never met. She thought of him cutting that single flaw into the false seal, his one act of defiance against a man who held all the power, and sealing it in the dark, and dying with the knowing of it, trusting that the building would not lie even if everyone who heard him did. She thought that he had not died a debtor or a fool. He had died a witness who had hidden his testimony where only an honest hand could reach it, and waited. Have you ever known a thing to be true and not been believed, and had to wait for the proof to outlast the lie? If you have, then you understand Amos Reedy, and you understand why Hannah Vance would not break his door with a wrecking bar. If a story like this one stays with you, there are others like it waiting. On the last evening of her first full year in the cabin, Hannah sat at the bench in the room that no one had been able to see from the door, and the lamp threw her shadow long across the honest dovetails and Dub's stamp once in the lean-to against the cold. The meadowlark brooch lay finished on the oiled cloth where the dead man had left it half done. She did not wear it. She kept it there on the bench in the room he had built, and she had opened a small worked thing of silver in the shape of a bird that sings before the light, finished at last by the right hand, in the place that had waited for it. The cold air of the hidden room was warm now. Outside, the larches stood black against the last of the day, and the cabin held the heat of the fire, and it did not lean into the hill any more. She had set it level. She set down her tools and looked at the bird a while, and then she banked the fire and slept, in a house that no longer kept a secret from anyone who cared to measure it true.